Welcome to yet another episode of the Below the Surface podcast. I'm Gunnar Hyde, your host, and I have my co-host here, James Hammond. How are you going, James?
I'm pretty good, Gunnar. How are you?
Following our latest acid sulfate soil interview with Sue Ellen and Christy and Angus, where Angus made a Top Gear reference.
Yeah.
I actually decided that from now on, I'm just going to call you Hammond. Now and then I'm going to shout Hammond. That's what it's going to be from now. You like it?
I like that, yeah.
I'll still introduce you as a James Bond wannabe, Hammond, yep. James Hammond. But
I'm happy with that. I've been called Hammond many times throughout my life, Hamo as well.
Hamo?
Yeah.
That's just, I don't know. I have nothing to say yet, but I'm going to think of something.
Think of something really witty and then splice it together as if you came up with it on the spot. That's the beauty of the podcast, isn't it?
Hamo. This sounds more like a rapper.
Yeah.
MC Hamo.
MC Hamo. Yeah. DJ Hamo.
Yeah. So we just finished our recording with Kylie Dodd. She's a risk assessor at GHD. And I think this one went really well. What do you think, Hammond?
That was good. That was a bit slow to start, but came around, I think. Came around partway through.
Oh yeah.
This is really one where I think you gotta sit down, listen, pay attention.
Oh yeah.
Maybe have the NEPM up in front of you while you listen, That'll help it really there's a lot of value there and that'll help it sink in a bit more.
Yes. Now she was good. Actually, for the fact that Kylie wasn't prepared.
Yeah.
That just shows expertise. When you get into an interview like this, and people fire questions at you, you are not prepared, and you answer them just like this. That just shows such a tremendous amount of expertise.
Exactly.
Or it shows that we were not prepared and didn't ask any decent questions. That's also possible.
Didn't ask hard enough questions. We did all right, I think. We had that was a nice structure as well, I think.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I agree. Yeah. So let's dive straight into it. Here's our interview with Dr. Kylie Dodd. Let's have a look what's going on here. Hello, Kylie, are you there?
Yeah, I've had to dial in from Teams. I've still got the Zoom circle going round and round on my...
That's so weird. Have you got the Zoom app, Kylie?
No, we don't use Zoom.
So you're going through...
Nobody really does, except for it just gives me better recording settings that then I can use in the post-processing. So that's why we're on Zoom and not on Teams. Anyway, so we are all together. Finally, we are. You are quite elusive on the internet. We just realized that we hadn't had any confirmation from you that you would join today. And then let's just call her. And then, hang on a minute. We don't even have any mobile numbers or anything else from you.
No, I don't. Not massively active on LinkedIn or anything like that.
Yeah, good. That makes two of us.
We're saying Gunnar's off LinkedIn, aren't you? And we're saying you keeping a low profile, Kylie. But good luck keeping a low profile after your BTS appearance. That things are just going to go crazy for you. I'm sure paparazzi and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Oh dear, stalking me on the streets of Orange.
Oh yeah. You will be stopped. You will not. The life that you have led so far is over. If you introduce yourself, then James and I don't have to record an introduction. So give us a little bit of a spiel of who you are, where you work, and why you're on here.
So my name's Kylie Dodd, and I am a risk assessor.
Okay.
And I look after the environmental toxicology and risk assessment kind of work that gets done at GHD in Australia. I am based in New South Wales, specifically in Orange, and I've been doing risk assessment work for longer than I'd care to admit at this point.
And you, if I may add to it, you came super highly recommended by people we very much respect. So we reached out to you. We first met when you were kind enough to talk Hammond and me through the PFAS research that we did as part of our preparation for the interview with the New South Wales Health Panel. You were very kind with your time and knowledge back then as part of our research, and we said, Kylie needs to talk to us more. icebreaker question. Hammond, go.
I don't know if you had time to think about this one, Kylie. We like to ask an icebreaker question. We typically go with who would play you in a movie of your life. So you could feel free to answer that one, or if you'd prefer, you could answer the question about who you'd rather have, someone you'd rather have dinner with, dead or alive. If you could have dinner with anybody, who would it be?
Goodness me, a movie about my life would not be very exciting. So I might answer the second one, which is who I'd like to have dinner with. I did have a quick thought about this morning, and the person that popped to my mind immediately was the late, great Jane Goodall, because she was such a fabulous and inspiring woman.
Mm-hmm.
She somehow managed to combine being like a formidable and brave scientific trailblazer and advocate with this kind of quiet, calm, and humbleness that I found really admirable. And she was such an icon.
She's an unbelievable person. Yeah, the world's definitely misses her.
Yeah, and she comes up a lot when you ask people this question.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, good one.
Definitely iconic.
All right. How did you end up as a risk assessor, Kylie? How does one become a risk assessor?
I think that's a good question, and I actually don't think there is a good answer to the question. How does one become a risk assessor? Because I think a lot of us just almost kind of fall into it, which is what happened to me. I finished my studies and I was working in research for a little bit, and then I was in my mid-20s and wanted to go adventuring and travel and have the flexibility to kind of work in different places and change my mind about what I wanted to do. So I joined an environmental consultancy firm. Luckily, my boss at the time was a risk assessor and saw in me kind of the potential to be a good risk assessor. And so I started doing it, found out that I had an aptitude for it, and have been doing it ever since. And although all risk assessors have a different path to getting into the field, I think universally we all have kind of quite a strong scientific background in sort of environmental chemistry or toxicology, and we're all problem solvers. So we're good at data analysis. That's probably universally what it takes to be a good risk assessor.
What did you study at uni?
I studied science, and then I went into doing a PhD in environmental chemistry.
Okay. And so, Kylie, so obviously we're talking here about risk assessment in the context of contaminated land and contaminants and their effects on human health and the environment. I mean, when we talk about risk assessment, like, does the skill set extend to other forms of risk assessment, or do you find that you get people who are from other areas or disciplines around risk assessment and management that kind of move into contaminated land? Is the skill set transferable?
So contaminated land risk assessment is quite a specific thing. And most of us that work in the contaminated land risk assessment space, we work primarily in assessing either contaminated sites or assessing the environmental risks that are related to a project that hasn't happened yet, like the development of a power station or development of a mine. Yeah. So we sort of work in both the existing contaminated space, but then also the kind of environmental impact assessment space.
Okay.
And we often work quite closely in that environmental impact assessment space, we work quite closely with air quality people. And so there's a lot of transferable skills there. And then obviously, as well as contaminated land expertise, people with skills in things like hydrogeology and hydrology and that sort of thing.
That's really cool. That's not something that I realized was involved. We typically think of risk assessment when you're dealing with an existing contamination issue. I have never really thought about it being done in terms of like projecting forward what a potential contamination outcome could be of something that's proposed but hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, and it's a different kind of a project. It's probably not the majority of our work, but it is a significant portion of our work.
Yeah.
And it's a different kind of project, so it's good to have that kind of mix.
Let's establish what Hammond and I are trying to achieve here today. So basically what we are trying to get across is a very, very simple explanation of risk assessments and tiny steps into risk assessments that allow run-of-the-mill environmental consultants and contaminated sites guys like me to make tiny steps past the tier 1 HIL's health investigation levels that we have in the National Environmental Protection Measure for contaminated sites in the NEPM. So because 99 out of 100 times when one of those tier 1 levels is exceeded across the site, people call for a remediation action plan, which is a shortcut, and that's what our industry seems to have settled on. Although in the NEPM, it clearly states that is not supposed to happen. So tell us, basically every consultant does a tier 1 risk assessment because we compare data that we find in our investigations against tier 1 health investigation levels in the NEPM. So that's already a risk assessment. Then we should go further. And what we're trying to achieve is that you give us a handful of little hints towards the end of our discussion today, where you say, hey, you don't have to be a full-fledged experienced risk assessor, but there are a few things that you can do as an environmental consultant to step past tier 1 into 1.5 or 1.3 and not into a tier 2 or tier 3 risk assessment. So what are those tiers in the first place? Let's talk about that for starters.
Yeah. Okay. So the point that you made that a lot of people step straight from tier 1 to remediation is very true. And I think it's probably like the biggest misconception about contaminated sites assessments generally. And it's one that's held from both the consultant level right through kind of to the regulator level. And that's definitely not what's supposed to happen. So a tier 1 risk assessment is essentially development of a CSM and then that screening exercise. So you compare your contaminant concentrations to these tier 1 guidelines that are published.
Sorry to interrupt, CSM.
Oh, conceptual site model. Yeah. So it's like a picture that you build of where the contamination is, how it got there, who or what might be exposed to it, and whether or not that exposure might be sufficient for there to be some sort of adverse effect on that, whoever it is that's being exposed. And I guess the key thing to keep in mind is that those tier 1 screening criteria are intentionally designed to be well below the concentrations at which some sort of risk or adverse effect to either a person or an ecosystem would actually occur. On the flip side, however, that means that if you step straight from a tier 1 screening exercise into remediation, you're almost always remediating too much.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, that's where the more detailed kind of tier 2, tier 3 type risk assessment comes in. Tier 2, tier 3 is typically where you hand it over to someone with some expertise in risk assessment. A tier 2 risk assessment is where you take those very generic tier 1 screening criteria and you make some relatively simple adjustments. You do some sort of more site specific but still relatively simple calculations, and you come up with a more site-specific assessment of whether those tier 1 screening criteria are actually going to translate into the possibility of, a risk or some sort of adverse effect. And then a tier 3 risk assessment, there's no kind of clear black and white line between what's a tier 2 and a tier 3, but basically the more detailed and more involved the process is and the more complicated it is, it tends to be shifting more towards a tier 3 assessment. And you get, in a tier 3 assessment, you get into things like very detailed probabilistic modelling and that kind of thing. And sometimes you'll get to a tier 2 and the answer will be that you have a risk, but that the complexity or the site-specific situation will mean that it's not warranted to go through to a tier 3. So you'll get to the end of a tier 2, you'll have a risk, and then the next step will be to go to remediation.
Right. So you can kind of exit at any point. You can sort of exit after the tier 2 assessment. You could exit after the tier 3, either into a decision that remediation is not required or that it is. But I guess going back to that key point is that the default seems to be to exit after a tier 1 assessment, particularly where you're saying that remediation is required to exit at that point. And really, that's not the way that the NEPM process was designed or envisaged when it was put together.
Yeah. Yep. And that's not the way the numbers were designed either.
Yes. You said with tier 2, there are a number of, you said calculations or relatively simple adjustments that can be made to the calculations that underpin the limits that have set. Are you able to just mention maybe a 2 or 3 of what those factors are that are changed?
If we're talking human health risk and human health criteria, at a broad level, for each contaminant, you've got an established kind of safe dose for that contaminant. So how much you have to get before some sort of health impact occurs. And then you've got a calculation around exposure. So how much is a person going to be exposed to in a site-specific setting? And if you've got more exposure than your safe dose, you essentially have a risk. And so exposure is controlled by things like where the contaminant is, what form it's in, how bioavailable it is, and then also what exposure looks like in a site-specific setting. So how often, how long, all of that kind of stuff. The other thing we often do in a tier 2 is we assess pathways that aren't covered by our tier 1 screening criteria.
Yeah.
And the contaminant that, of course, pops to mind at the minute is PFAS. The tier 1 screening criteria for PFAS don't necessarily do a great job allowing us to screen for things like, people having chooks in their garden or PFAS in an agricultural setting where there might be livestock. So the tier 2 process often either makes an adjustment to those kind of basic exposure equations that underpin the tier 1 criteria, or it addresses pathways for which there are no good criteria.
So we have been talking very, very theoretically here now, and if anybody is still listening,
Gunnar knows our audience is full of nerds just like us. We're talking to our own people here, Gunnar.
Yeah, but no offense to the two of you here. I'm getting squirmish in my own podcast here. I'm like, okay, let's get to something I can touch here. Okay, so So Kylie, first of all, how the NEPM came up with these conservative health investigation levels is outlined in the NEPM. No kidding, it's basically in Schedule 7. So if anybody doesn't want to, every consultant really needs to have a look at Schedule 7. How did the committee actually come up with the values that we now religiously use in our assessment? And what are the parameters that we can possibly change here? So maybe Kylie, you and I, we can now slightly dive into some of these parameters that make up the HILs, the health investigation levels. So if I go to Table 5 in Schedule 7, Section 5.2, I think it is. But if everybody looks at Table 5 in Schedule 7, you will see there are all these parameters that have been taken into account. They go from body weight to the exposure duration, exposure frequency, and down to lifetime factors, how much time is spent outdoors, indoors, how many vegetables are being eaten. So in this table, it's all outlined for the different land use scenarios. For those who are not contaminated sites geeks, we are given 4 basic land use scenarios. One is for residential use with a lot of soil access, that's HIL-A. HIL-B is for residential use with little soil access, so many apartments with a couple of landscaped areas around it. Then we have HIL-C for open spaces, parklands, footpaths, bus stops, whatever else falls into this area. And then commercial industrial, HIL-D, where people work in basically in the HIL-D, by the way, is not designed for open air areas like rail yards and these kind of things. HIL-D, you need to really read, dear colleagues, what HIL-D is for. It's for an office environment out in, for example, Western Sydney, where somebody sits more or less in an office all day, but now and then walks out into lunch breakout areas. So HIL-D anyway, different podcast we need to do on this one. So we have the 4 different land use scenarios, and this table here, table 5 in Schedule 7, outlines all the assumptions that were made when they came up with the HIL. So body weight is easy. Of all those, I don't know if you have the table in front of you, Kylie. There are some assumptions. Let's just go easy, for example, on HIL-A for residential land use. So the body weight is assumed at 70 kilos. The exposure duration for an adult is assumed to be 29 years, so that someone is exposed to lead in the backyard for 29 years, for 365 days a year. And we assume that every adult ingests, so eats 50 milligrams of dust or soil every day. The skin surface area is taken into account. Fraction of the skin exposed, of course, we are usually closed. We don't run around in the backyard naked and roll in the soil. So a certain percentage is taken off here. And then we have 20 hours of spent indoors and 4 hours outdoors for these assumptions. And we eat 10% of homegrown vegetables. So these are the basic assumptions here. If I look at them, they are not conservative. They are ultra conservative. I mean, these are seriously conservative assumptions. Who spends 4 hours every day in the backyard eating 50 grams of soil with 30% of their skin exposed and eating 10% of homegrown vegetables? I cannot think of any scenario where that is actually the case. I mean, do you care to comment? I'm not trying to poo-poo on the NEPM here too much, but when I read these, I'm like, that gave me a totally different impression of what I'm actually comparing my concentrations to and how conservative they really are.
Yeah, that is the key thing to keep in mind. They're supposed to be, you would not expect there to be any situations where you had concentrations kind of below your HILs that were a risk. So they're purposely designed to be very conservative. The other thing to keep in mind is that the way the HILs are developed, they estimate exposure via ingestion of soil, ingestion of vegetables, inhalation of dust, and uptake of contaminants through the skin. And so all of those parameters are important because it's looking at all of those different pathways. But not all of those pathways are important for every single contaminant. So depends on the contaminant as to what pathway and what parameters actually make an important contribution to your HIL.
Yeah.
And the other thing to keep in mind is that adults aren't the driver for the number that is the HIL. In most circumstances, our most sensitive receptor is our child, and the HILs are in most cases developed on the basis of those child numbers, not those adult numbers. So it is that child exposure that is, it's the child playing in the backyard essentially, or sort of crawling around on the floor in the house that is the driver of the HIL number.
The vegetable and fruit consumption rate. So this is the main exposure parameter in this table that's about ingesting things that are grown in that soil. Can it be equivalent to ingesting eggs from chickens that are in that same area, or is it kind of a bit different?
Kind of a bit different. And for a lot of the contaminants, the consumption of fruit and vegetables is not something which is a big sort of driver of that actual HIL value, unless you've got a contaminant that's bioaccumulative, like your PFAS. Yeah. In a lot of cases, it's the incidental ingestion of soil, which is the main exposure pathway that determins what our HIL value is.
So I think everyone does need to be aware of what these factors are, just so they can understand where the HILs and I guess EILs and other numbers have come from. And I know what you're saying too, Gunnar, which is like you struggle to envisage a scenario where all these things are happening all at once and you're getting all these exposures. But I suppose, it's designed to capture any possible situation where this kind of level of exposure could occur. And I'm thinking in my head as we're talking, I'm like, well, what sort of exposure do you have to soil, like to ingestion of soil or inhalation of soil? But you think you mow the lawn on a dusty day and it's kicking up all this dust and you're breathing that in. And like there are these incidental exposures that we probably don't think of very much that are probably there.
Yeah, okay, Hammond. They are incidental.
It's not usually me, the one who's arguing for conservatism, Gunnar, but let me have a go at it.
Yeah, conservative is my middle name. But so you mow the lawn, fine. That's one day. But what I'm saying is like, of course the committee came up, but with all these, but these are assumptions for 30 years every day.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You don't mow the lawn every day. You don't go out in the backyard every day. Even your boys don't go out into the backyard.
That's true.
Every day.
Not for 4 hours or whatever it is.
You wish.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So the other thing to keep in mind is that the 70 years thing is important if you've got a contaminant that's a carcinogen where risk happens over a lifetime of exposure.
Mm-hmm.
But for most of our contaminants, they're not carcinogens. So that 70-year number doesn't actually even come into the calculation. So the calculation is made over essentially a 12-month period. So for a lot of the metals, for example, the HIL is based on a small child during that sort of young and relatively susceptible period of their life, ingesting, significant amounts of soil incidentally. So that 70-year number over a lifetime only comes into play if you're talking about a carcinogen.
What are the usual suspects you deal with, as in contaminants?
In general, or
yeah, well, I tell you here's where I'm heading. Almost exclusively, I am dealing in contaminated sites 8 or 9 out of 10 times. I deal with either benzoyl or lead, very rarely arsenic. And I am no longer, I used to be, I'm no longer a lot in service station sites. So in there we would be dealing with the usual, with the benzene mostly, but with the petroleum hydrocarbons. But these are the what I call the usual suspects that I come across around Sydney. Yes, there are the chlorinated hydrocarbons that you come across now and then and so on. But ultimately, most of the time we are dealing on my sites, I'm dealing with either lead or benzoyl. These are the ones that usually come across.
Well, they're the ones that seem to trigger the tier 1 levels the most, I guess, at least in the kind of projects that we've been exposed to in our career. They're the ones that just seem to trigger those levels most often.
Are these the ones you deal with mostly, or are you going into much higher echelons of contaminants?
So interestingly, back in the early days of my career, I dealt almost exclusively with hydrocarbons.
Yeah.
A lot of petrol stations and that sort of thing. And then the CRC Care, Friebel and Nadebaum guidelines came out, and that almost sort of disappeared overnight. I no longer do very much hydrocarbon work because risk assessment's less needed now for those, because that guideline is kind of so comprehensive, and you can screen out a lot of hydrocarbon risks a lot more easily than you could back in the day. So yeah, these days, a lot of PFAS, because PFAS is so complicated and the tier 1 screening criteria do such a poor job of putting good numbers around what is actually likely to be a risk in terms of PFAS. And yeah, a lot of metals, lead, BAP, and I do both human health and ecological risk assessment. So in the ecological risk assessment space, we do a lot around metals, nutrients, those kinds of things.
I feel like ecological risk assessment could be its own thing. I wouldn't mind going deep on that another time, actually. So I'm sure there's quite different factors. Like you mentioned a couple there, but I'm sure they're quite different factors that go into that than those that go into health risk assessment. Is that right? Or
yeah, it's a very different process.
So Kylie, I assess a site and I come across lead levels that are above the HILA, B or C, or whatever it is, and I come across old boiler ash and some slag as per usual here in Sydney that exceeds my benzoypyrene sometimes quite significantly. What should be my next step instead of instantly calling for the removal of that material basically, or capping it, or whatever people come up with? What would be my next step that I should do in an ideal case with no time pressure and an understanding client? And what would be my next step? Okay, so now I have leaded 450 or 500 parts per million, and I have benzoypyrenes instead of the allowed or the tier 1 of 3, I have it at 5 or 7. What should I do now?
So the thing that people can do most easily, I think, once they get through that screening process and have exceedances, is to do, it's almost like a CSM, like a conceptual site model on steroids, basically. So without even kind of fiddling with any of the HILs or doing anything like that, making sure you have the best CSM you possibly can around what your site uses and exposure actually looks like in that setting. And then the other thing is to do a detailed analysis of your data and think about things like statistical approaches to dealing with a whole data set rather than looking at exceedances on a sort of sample by sample type basis. Because a lot of times we will get a site sort of land on our desk as risk assessors, and we don't even need to get to the point where we need to go into like a tier 2 or a tier 3 assessment. We're able to, just by doing a really great CSM that thinks in a lot of detail around what does exposure look like in this setting, who are our receptors, how is our contamination distributed, what factors are there that are going to reduce exposure, just allow you on a qualitative basis to move away from jumping straight into, okay, let's just dig it up or cap it or whatever.
Well, but doing that, Kylie, would mean that someone, me as the consultant, I will have to stand up and say, hey, you know what? That land use scenario for low density residential with soil access that was assumed in the NEPM, that's just not going to happen on this particular residential development here. And the only argument I would have is like, hey, like we discussed before, these assumptions are just way too conservative for my liking. But then again, that's not an argument that flies in a decent environmental report. So what are the assumptions that I can quite easily make that would possibly help me get over the line and not immediately call for remediation? Do you know what I mean? When you say, hey, you know what, you need to have a decent CSM, conceptual site model. I understand that. But ultimately, most of the time at GHD in your job, you are dealing with way, way larger projects of mine sites and airports and infrastructure developments. Many consultants, me included, deal with small scale to medium scale sites where somebody is going to put a bunch of apartments up or a bunch of terraces go up, or a development out in Schofields where they put 500 houses on 74 square meters. That's the kind of assessments we are talking about. And I'm finding it super hard to then say, well, you know, if I read these assumptions that are made in the Schedule 7, of course they are hyper conservative. As a non-risk assessor, as a baby risk assessor here, I can't really go against those assumptions. I mean, by merely saying that doesn't make any sense. Where can I actually hook in and say, what's the easiest way where I can hook in and say, okay, this is an assumption I can actually change?
So I guess the first thing is like, so you're building apartments, that kind of thing. Is the contamination going to be exposed is the first thing. Like if it's going to be covered up, that obviously is that's going to mitigate your risk. And then what's the spatial extent of your contamination? So is most of the site below the HILs and you've just got a small area that's above, and is there a way to deal with that distribution statistically speaking? And if you've done all of that and you still have, you know, an exceedance and a potential risk, what is best thing to do depends on like your site. If you've got like literally an uncontrolled low residential setting, and you've got metal contamination or PAH contamination or something like that, the only sort of parameter that you can really do much about in terms of adjusting it is the bioaccessibility of that particular contaminant, because that's something that you can test for, and you can adjust your HIL for it. But other than that, there's not a huge amount you can change really in that low density residential setting, because it's such an uncontrolled setting and people can do such a huge range of things. You've got very limited opportunities there.
And so it sounds like to me that sort of for non-experts, for non-risk assessment professionals, really the key thing to do is really about looking at the detail of what's being proposed on that site and then looking at your data set in that context. And I think a really good example of this is, like you said, if we're talking about redevelopment, in the middle of Sydney, where you're bulking out 3 levels of basement on a site, so often and that basement might cover 90% of the actual footprint of that site. So often we see remedial action plans where we've got hotspot removal within the footprint of the bulk excavation. And you just look at that and you're like, why are we doing a wrap here? When you look at the conceptual site model, all that material is going to be gone by the time anybody's actually on this site. So that alone should tell you, for a non-risk assessment person, you can refine your CSM and say, there is no contamination here to be remediated, because the part of what is being proposed on this site is to bulk out all of this material and take it away. And so therefore, all that's required is a waste classification, not a remedial action plan. Is that kind of an example of what you're talking about there, Kylie?
Yeah. So if your contaminant is, a metal or a PAH, if there's something in between the contaminant and the people that are using the site, i.e. a basement or a slab or something like that, that's going to mitigate your exposure. So remediating to your HIL makes no sense.
Well, that's it. And I mean, often if we're talking about deeper excavations, there's, typically those contaminants are going to be in that fill or that upper strata of soil. And then if you're getting into residual or bedrock below that, you're getting into uncontaminated layers. So it's kind of like, but it seems to be a very common thing that we still see, which is, hotspot removal within the footprint of a bulk excavation, which really doesn't make any sense.
Yep.
And so I just wanted to go to the tier 3 assessment. So just taking it that little bit further. So you said that is really when you start doing more complex modeling. What kind of modeling or sort of parameters would you look at in a tier 3 assessment?
So I guess tier 3 assessment, so if you think about like that table in the Schedule B7, where there's one parameter for each exposure parameter that you're interested in, and all of those are at the sort of upper end of what's a reasonable range. You've got the kid that's the smallest kid, and they're ingesting, the upper end of the range of soil, and they're doing all of these things together. And in a tier 3 type assessment, we typically look at what's the realistic range of each of those exposure parameters and what happens when you combine them all together, and then you typically run your model lots of different times and you end up with kind of a probability distribution curve. So it tells you what's the average individual look like, and what's your very, very worst case individual look like, and sort of getting a picture of that. And that helps you to make more sensible decisions around risk management. Because oftentimes you'll find that if you combine all of those very worst case assumptions together, you end up with a scenario that's so conservative that it actually kind of doesn't make any sense. And so moving into that more nuanced tier 3 assessment, where you look at the range of each parameter and how they combine together, that's what that assessment is.
One of the parameters that I have come across in I wouldn't even call it tier 2, these are tier 1.5 risk assessments, was that the benzoapyrene that we come across in Sydney in fill so often is old. It is not fresh PAHs as the assumption is in the NEPM. So these are boiler ashes and slag that is from 1890 to 1920 probably. So it is very old, it is aged, and you can adjust which one is it? Is it the dermal absorption factor that you changed there from the fresh benzoyl that is assumed in an NEPM to an old one, to an aged polyaromatic hydrocarbon? And that then in the NEPM toolbox, which I will link to in the show notes, there's a very easy to understand and nice Excel spreadsheet in there where all these assumptions are already by default in there. And if you go and change it to the dermal absorption factor from the fresh benzoyl to old one, that already is a change, that the HIL for benzoyl from 3 to 5 milligrams per kilogram. First of all, is that an assumption that I'm making? Is that correct? And secondly, are there any other little tricks that you can use?
So one of the most powerful things for those kind of, non-volatile type contaminants like your PAHs is thinking about bioaccessibility. Because like you said, the NEPM assumes 100% bioaccessible, and that's often not the case when the contaminant's old. And so you can test for bioaccessibility too, and that's a really powerful tool, because oftentimes you'll test a particularly aged contamination and you'll find it's much lower than the default assumption. And then you can make those kind of relatively easy site-specific adjustments in that HIL model.
I need to plug our own podcast here. Was it episode 28 or 38 or
38?
38, where we speak to Dr. Albert Juhas, who is a bioavailability specialist, and he explains that extremely well, and how all this works and how to analyze for it. So everybody go back and listen to that one there.
Yes, and quite often we send samples to Albert, so he's the man in terms of that.
Awesome. That's good to know. This kind of segues nicely into one of the next points here, which is really around just who can do risk assessments realistically. So Gunnar, you've mentioned there, tier 1.5, we're making up our own little delineations in the process here. But Kylie, what would your advice be in terms of, with some training and experience, a non-risk assessment expert like us, what are we've talked about a couple of things that somebody could do to adjust their own assessments, but where do you draw the line, I guess, is what I'm trying to get to. Like, at what point do you think that somebody should really say, this is beyond my expertise, and really seek out a risk assessor's advice?
I think the term that you used is a tier 1.5, and we use that term a lot.
Yep.
It's the taking your detailed site investigation data as far as you possibly can, without getting too far into the fiddling with the numbers. That's probably the point. If there's a huge amount of fiddling with the numbers to be done, it's often best if you hand it off to someone who's got some experience, because you can get yourself in trouble pretty quickly. But looking at your CSM with the eyes of a risk assessor is something that everyone can do. Like I'll get a bunch of data, and I'll get a bunch of photos of core logs and things like that. And there'll be no photos of the actual site, what the site itself looks like, who's there, what's there, all of that kind of stuff. And so I often have to really push for that kind of extra information that helps you to understand the scenario and to think sensibly about what exposure is actually going to look like.
Yeah. There's two kind of scenarios there when we're talking about exposure pathways and receptors, because there's sites where you're assessing it and the activity that is currently happening there will continue. And there are sites where the activity is changing. So the site's being redeveloped in some way, and you're therefore making assumptions based on what is planned to be done on a site. So maybe we come back to that in a sec. But something else I'm really interested in, we talked about it before, the tier 1 levels and how people grab onto them. What is your view on getting regulators across the line with risk assessments? Because I think the reason why so many of us jump to remediation or decision-making from tier 1 assessments is that the numbers, as conservative as they are, they give us something tangible to grab onto. That is a clear number, that is objective, it's on the page. You can compare your data set to that number. And I feel like there's a tendency, not in all regulators, but particularly some that may be challenged with capability and that sort of thing, to grab onto those tier 1 numbers as well.
Wait, Hammond. Did you just say challenged with capability? What have you? What are you running for parliament? Or have you join the marketing team of a big company? What's challenged with capability? Never mind. I'll let you go. Keep going.
What's been your experience, or what's some advice you can give around getting regulators across the line with a risk assessment that is a bit more of a complex, some would say subjective process?
The key, like risk assessment, and I often hear people often say like, "Oh, you guys just made it. You just risked it away."
Yeah,
like
I've heard that
sort of
that throwaway line used as well. Like it's a derogatory kind of kind of line.
Yeah.
As if this was a bad thing. This is great.
Yeah.
This is fantastic. So we have assessed, is there a risk? No, there isn't one. Excellent. No more work required.
Yeah.
No risk. Let's move on. Thank you. It's not a bad thing at all.
No, it's a good thing. And I think,
absolutely.
I think those of us that do it, we take it very seriously, and it's a really scientific process. So we don't get to a low risk conclusion just off, a vibe or whatever. Like if we change an input parameter when we model something, we do it based on what the guidelines say, what the science says, and then we put in a justification and an explanation around what we've done. And I guess that's the key to getting it across the line with a regulator.
And do you find that you get pushback from, I guess, people who don't have as much experience in this, or who maybe struggle to understand the concepts? Like, do you find that creates a barrier to moving forward with risk assessments?
Yeah, I do think there is a barrier. I find it very frustrating when people say, "Oh, you just risked it away," like it wasn't a proper scientific thing that we were doing. Yeah, you do have to have a level of expertise, kind of critically review a risk assessment, and we're lucky in Australia that we have the kind of audit system, whereby at those very complicated sites, you've got that independent review from the auditor who has their own internal risk assessment expert team. So the regulator can have the confidence that the risk assessment's done properly and all that sort of thing.
Yes. So on more complicated sites, when you're faced with probably doing a risk assessment, probably good to get an auditor involved if they're not already.
Yeah, but for those sort of basic sites, I think as long as you explain what you did, the sites without an auditor, as long as what you've done is explained well and justified, I haven't had any trouble with regulators accepting a risk-based approach, if you've done it properly.
That leads me to another point here, which is around, so some of those assumptions or parameters that go into particularly the exposure parameters for sites where there's a development plan. So we're assessing the risk against a future planned redevelopment of that site. I'm just wondering about the practicalities of how you factor in those things, and then what happens if they change, and then how those things are controlled. Say we're talking about an area that is above the relevant levels, but it's going to be covered with a hard stand, for example. And so in our CSM, we've said factor means that area doesn't require remediation, and away we go. There are some practical things that can come up, as we all know, through the development process. Say that project gets approved, you're then in the construction phase, there might be some change to the design or that's necessary or whatever, and all of a sudden that's a landscape area and not a hard stand area. And I'm just wondering how you deal with those kinds of practicalities. And then also whether, when you have these kinds of assumptions built into your CSM or your risk assessment, do you then have to have any kind of environmental management plan or something like that controls that, or make sure that those assumptions are followed through with in that assessment? Like, is there any kind of cyclical thing to come back and look at that?
I think if it's reasonable to assume that whatever it is you've assumed in your risk assessment is the way it's going to stay, then you don't have to have a specific control in place. But if it's the sort of thing where it could theoretically change relatively easily, it's important to have that sort of environmental management plan in place. And even if things change, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to fully revisit the risk assessment. So say in your example where you were going to have hard stand on an area of contamination, and then the plan changed and all of a sudden you had landscaped area on that particular portion of the site. Something as simple as, having some clean fill on the top can do the same job as the hard stand. It's just a matter of understanding how risk would occur and thinking of another way to sort of stop that exposure pathway happening.
And we talk about environmental management plans, or EMPs, coming into play where we're leaving contamination on a site. So we've assessed a site, there is contamination present, rather than remediate, or we might partially remediate, but then the remainder is dealt with through a long-term environmental management plan. Can the outcome of a risk assessment also be we don't need to remediate, however, there are certain factors that need to be controlled, and therefore an EMP is the right vehicle to do that through?
Yeah, that is quite often the case.
Okay.
So quite often the risk assessment process will say, this is what exposure looks like in this particular setting. These are the things that are going to mitigate your exposure effectively in this particular setting. And therefore, if you have some sort of plan in place to make sure that that mitigation mechanism stays there, so the hard stand stays there or whatever, then your risks are low and you're right.
Okay. Avoiding EMPs is often a reason cited by clients as to why they would rather just dig and dump and get rid of stuff rather than go down some of these more some of these other pathways that are available. So it is a possible outcome of a risk assessment that an EMP, a long-term EMP, is required on a site.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And I guess that's a question for whoever's dealing, like it's the remedial options assessment process. Yeah.
So when you do a risk assessment and you risk assess a risk away, no remediation required here, although some of the tier 1 levels are exceeded. That does not necessarily mean, if you have determined that there is no risk, that doesn't mean there has to be an environmental management plan in place on that side. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay,
oftentimes you can come to a low risk conclusion without, need for an EMP. But in some circumstances, we can come to a conclusion that if you were to have an EMP, risks would be low. And then at that particular site, you can decide, is it easier just to dig it up, or is an EMP a more cost-effective, balance those two things?
I can see that coming into play, particularly where there's things where there are behavioural controls that are part of the assumptions that go into the risk assessment, or that there are, like you said, there are factors on a site that could quite easily change through a design construction phasing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. That's good to know. I didn't really kind of get that subtlety. I don't think about risk assessment. So I say this all the time. It's good to just understand what those potential outcomes are so that you can contingency plan and you can advise your clients or whoever you're advising better as to what those potential outcomes could be.
Kylie, really quick, we're coming to the end. If I, as the environmental consultant, what mistakes do I make, or what should I change in my sampling plan to make life for a risk assessor easier?
The thing that is most helpful to a risk assessor is collecting the information that you need to develop that really good CSM, understanding your hydrogeology, understanding site use. And one thing we haven't talked about, we're talking mainly about human health risk here, but things like exceedance of the ecological investigation levels are often a driver for some sort of remediation, and collecting the information around your receptors to support a good tier 2 risk assessment. Collecting enough data, so making sure that you've thought about kind of your sources, collecting samples in the right place, thinking about sample depth in terms of what exposure is going to look like, collecting samples at the right depth, and then thinking about things like bioaccessibility. Is your contaminant a non-volatile contaminant where bioaccessibility might be important? Collecting that data if you need to. And obviously volatile contaminants is a whole different thing, but you can get into things like, gas monitoring and that sort of thing. But it's all about the CSM is the message.
And the CSM is something that people often kind of gloss over, isn't it? Like it's just a bit of we're going through the motions of putting a CSM together, but there's some real value in it clearly, in that it can allow you, it may allow you to form a view that remediation isn't required in some cases.
Yeah, definitely. It's a pretty powerful tool, I think.
And I meant to say this before, GHD has some of the nicest CSMs that I've seen in my career. I really like them. The pictures, yeah. I'm not going to ask you to reveal the IP as to what you actually use and how you do it, but GHD's CSMs.
What the hell? Give us the IP. What are you using? Come on.
We're gonna have to beep it out on the podcast, Gunnar.
We have some fabulous people with some skills in, graphics and all that sort of thing.
Do you think that AI is going to level the playing field a little bit with some, in terms of graphical CSMs, do you think?
It's not at the minute. So I've tried, just out of interest, trying to get AI to develop me some really good CSMs, and I haven't had any luck yet, but you never know.
Might get there one day.
Yeah, maybe, but a good CSM is a complicated thing that really needs some thought. So AI is definitely not there yet, I don't think.
I saw one of there's a site that I'm working on at the moment that GHD's worked on previously, and the CSM for that site is excellent and has been a very good tool to help everybody understand, particularly client side, help to understand what's actually going on that site.
I have nothing else to say anymore. You guys have a new office? Is that right?
Yes, we do in Orange. We've spent years in this funny little office with no windows and like rats in the roof, and and we've just got this brilliant office with like windows on, 3 walls, and we're sort of all in shock, really.
The bar is low. You have an office with windows. Woohoo!
It's so good. Yeah, really nice.
Orange is a very nice part of the world too. I didn't actually realize you were based there.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, one of the good things I do like about GHD. There's a whole pile of us that sit in Orange who work all over the country. There's a lot of flexibility around.
Do you do a lot of site visits as the risk assessor?
I try. If it's a big complicated site, I tend to insist. Because that ability to develop that really good CSM and understand what exposure looks like, you just can't get it unless you've been to the site.
Kylie, thank you.
Hopefully that was all right. I definitely wasn't prepared.
Well, you did an awesome job. If that's you unprepared, I mean, yeah, you definitely did a great job.
It's hard to talk about risk assessment in a way that doesn't kind of send everyone to sleep.
Like I said, our audience, we're talking to our own people here. They'll love this stuff.
No, it was awesome. I really enjoyed it, especially since we've interviewed Albert Juhasz beforehand, and now this is rounded up. Now it doesn't this episode will not turn people into risk assessors, but it will broaden people's horizons, and that's what this is all about. But I don't think there was anything massively controversial here today. Even I behaved.
Very well behaved today, Gunnar.
I was.
You did tell us we were boring at one point.
What can I say? I stand by it. Thank you. I let you go. All the best.
Okay.
Thanks,
much
Kylie.
appreciated.
Bye.